Hello folks, the Y Guy here again, and I do want to welcome you to my home on this nice cold winter morning. Finally the sun came out for the first time in 2 weeks, I think. Anyway, I got to hurry with this video because it's going to be dark by 3:30 or 4 o'clock. You can imagine that I live in the Northwest, obviously, with this kind of sun. But anyway, this video is called The Y Guy. Jesus was a pragmatist. Or I was thinking about toying with the idea of calling it the Y Guy Practical Jesus. All right? Before I get going on this video, please consider looking me up on Facebook under the group The Y Guy, and or my avatar, Jonathan Jones. And on this video, give me a thumbs up, thumbs down, and explain why, and be polite about it, please, if you don't agree with me on this. We can have a good discussion and learn from each other. That's the purpose of these videos, is to, well, basically kind of to vent a little bit. And, you know, if you do research and things are building up inside of you, it's got to go somewhere. You know, you just can't hold things inside of you as if they didn't exist and just keep things close to the vest. You're not helping anyone else. And anyway, I hope you understand my reasoning here for doing these videos. Again, this video is called the Y Guy Jesus is a Pragmatist, or the Y Guy Practical Jesus. I don't know yet what I'm going to do. But anyway, you know, by ignoring most practical applications or practical applicable aspects, I should put it that way, of what Jesus actually said and did, as recorded what he said and did. By ignoring the practicality of it all, religion has then put God and or Jesus in this little box. Okay, what they've done, this box of mysticism and symbolism, and you know, let's face it, by doing that, it causes conjecture and assumptions, and by doing that too, it results in the doctrines of men. That's how doctrines of men just formulate, you see, by doing that. So my reasoning here, this video, so thinking outside that box, okay, that religion has put us in, it causes me to see Jesus as a pragmatist. It's simple, okay? Now here's a few examples of what I'm talking about. Okay, let's take some parables and some things that Jesus said and did. Like I said, the parables of the sheep and the goats. Okay, you know, religion takes that parable and runs with it, with the symbolism and mysticism and conjecture and assumption, and then they jump to conclusions, all right, without even considering the practicality of who Jesus was talking to and where he was standing at the time. And let's back up a little bit before we even get into it. Let's lay some foundation work here. Jesus is the one who said, it's recorded that he said he came only for the house of Israel. Okay? Now, when we say he came for, I'm talking about the sandal-wearing Jesus, the Jesus who walked and talked amongst men, that Jesus. I'm not talking about the glorified Jesus that Paul ran into and got knocked on his butt, okay, and blinded. That I'm not saying that's a different Jesus, but that's a different aspect of Jesus. He came to Paul for a different reason. He came to Paul for the purpose of the reason for the Gentiles. All right? But the Jesus who said, I came but only for the house of Israel, that Jesus is the one I'm talking about. Because, again, practicality, Christians try to put themselves in the sandals of the Jews. They're Jewish wannabes. Christians are Jewish wannabes. And practicality says, no, you've got to have a foundation, a context that Jesus said, I came only for the house of Israel. Now, I'm going to build upon that using practical aspects. Okay, I hope you're understanding where I'm coming from here, okay? So before we get into these parables, we got to understand of who the parables were for, who they were directed to. They weren't directed to the Gentiles because the glorified Jesus wasn't glorified yet. He wasn't raised from the dead. He didn't meet Paul yet. He didn't share another gospel, the gospel to the Gentiles, with anyone yet at this point in history and in context. Okay? So the parable of the sheep and the goats, Christians, I'm sorry, it wasn't for you. It wasn't meant for you. It wasn't directed to you. You didn't exist at the time. Okay? There was no such thing as Christianity. So Jesus was approaching and talking to Jews because he came for the house of Israel. So you've got to zoom in on that, all right? So sheep and the goats religion says, well, it's all for Christians and it's all about us, and those on his right are Christians and are believers, and they were the sheep, and those on his left are the goats. They were the unbelievers, and the sheep and the goats are going to go to hell. I'm sorry, the goats are going to go to hell, and the sheep are going to go to heaven. And as you've done to the least of these, now here's the key phrase that Jesus uses. He goes, you know, when they're saying the people in this parable are saying, but Lord, we didn't, when didn't we visit you in prison? When didn't we visit you in the hospital? You know, all of these kind of things. And Jesus said, as you did unto the least of these, my brethren. That's a key word there. My brethren. Who was Jesus' brethren? Were they Christians? See, Christians want to insert themselves in that and go, well, Jesus is my brother. At the time he wasn't, because there was no such thing as Christians. Okay? The practical Jesus, my brethren, were the Jews. And he was talking about the house of Israel. Okay? The actual physical Israel. Because, you know, if everything is going to be tossed aside as mysticism and symbolism and all that kind of stuff, Jesus didn't have to come. He didn't have to come in the flesh. Okay? He could have done all these kind of things through the power of God, through the creativity of God and all of that. There was no need. If everything was going to be symbolized and you know, metaphoricalized, I don't know such word. But anyway, if that's how it was all going to be done, there'd be no need for a physical Jesus to actually walk and talk among men. All right? Again, there's a practical purpose why Jesus was here, and I want to get into that. Now, the practical aspect of the sheep and the goats, think about this. Since he was talking to Jews, and since he was talking about his brethren, as you done unto the least of these, my brethren, then you've got to consider that the sheep and the goats were the Jews and those who persecuted the Jews. See, that's the practical aspect. Now, has that been going on? It's going on today. You can turn on the news anytime you want, and you've got all these countries surrounding Israel. Gee, the one who Jesus said he came for. And they're doing all these things. They're not supporting Israel. They're not supporting Israel when they're in prison. They're not supporting Israel when they're in the hospital. They're not feeding Israel. They're not clothing Israel. All these nations surrounding Israel are wanting to kill Israel as if they never existed. They want to eliminate them. Okay? So I'm just doing the practical aspect. I did a video already on the white guy, the sheep, and the goats, and you know, I kind of gave an analogy of possibilities. I'm not saying it's the truth, okay, of how Jesus would be standing before the UN, you know, and addressing these nations, and how he would be addressing these nations as you sent Scud missiles over to my brethren, you did unto me. As you persecuted my brethren, the Israel, you did unto me. You see, I'm looking at a practical aspect of what might take place. But of course, then, you know, some people poo-poo this video as being, you know, eschatology, teaching, end times. No, I'm not trying to do that at all. I'm just trying not to throw the baby out with the dirty bathwater and say that it is finished. Because maybe some aspects is finished and some are not. That's all I'm saying. For my preterist friends, all right. Now let's move on to Laz and the rich dude. Okay, practical Christians take this thing with their mysticism and symbolism and all of their conjectures and assumptions and jumping to conclusions, and they say this is about hell. Hell has nothing to do with that parable. Please, if you get a chance, review my video on Laz and the rich dude. You know. Because I kind of get into it in detail, but I'm just going to skim real quickly here of the practicality of it all. and how religion has taken this and they've run with it and said that the rich man is in hell, when the true Greek translation for that word that the Latins put in there as hell, it was called unseen. Okay, a lack of understanding. That's where the rich man was. He was in the place of unseen, where nobody has an understanding. And who was Jesus talking to? He was talking to Jews. So he brought up Abraham, and they totally understood where he was coming from, because there's a little thing called the covenant of Abraham, which people choose to ignore. I don't know why they ignore it. It has not been fulfilled, folks. All right? For those who believe in it is finished, that promise has not been completed. All right? You combine that with... let me continue. I'm gonna end up chasing a rabbit here, and rambling too much. You see, so Lazarus in the Greek, that's his Greek name, Lazarus. Okay? What was his Jewish... back in Abraham's Eleazar, that guy that was back with Abraham in the Old Testament. You got to go back to Genesis, and you got to find out who was close to Abraham's bosom, who was in Abraham's bosom, who back there in Genesis was so close to his heart that he was going to turn all of God's promises over to a Gentile. Eleazar, I believe it was his name. Abraham's sidekick, his best friend, his confidant, his buddy, his son, basically, before Isaac was ever born, before all of that stuff happened with Sarah and her getting pregnant, being an old lady, and him being an old guy. You know the story. I'm hoping. So anyway, Eleazar, translated in the Greek, is Lazarus. See, there's a practical aspect here. The Jews understood, okay, that all the promises that was promised to Abraham, thus promised to the Jews, was going to be given over to Gentiles. And you know what? It kind of happened. I mean, you look in history, it kind of happened. All right? And the rich dude, the guy, if you just read the practicality of it all, he was dressed in robes of purple, and there's in the Old Testament, it's called the royal priesthood. Who's the royal priesthood? The Jews, the nation of Israel. They were given, see, I'm looking at this as all practical. They were given the responsibility to show the love of God to the planet, a practical planet, a real physical planet, Earth. But they didn't do it. They dropped the ball, so it was given over to Lazarus. But yet this rich man, practicality, is looking up and saying, oh, just give me a taste of it. Give me a taste of that promise. It's called just a drop of water on my tongue. And he was tortured by a flame, not flames, plural, but flame, singular. Look that up in the Greek, and you'll discover that it's not fire. Okay? So anyway, let's one last one, Gehenna. Okay, that's a biggie. All right, Christians have run with that as using mysticism and symbolism and then a whole bunch of conjecture and assumptions and jumping into major conclusions when Gehenna is simply a trash dump. But no. Let's run with religion and put God in this box, and let's call it hell. Since the Latins got a hold of that word, and they translated every time Jesus said Gehenna, they translated it into hell, when Gehenna is a trash dump. So there's a practical thing here. Jesus, who is Jesus talking to? He's talking to the Jews. He's sitting there in Gehenna, and he's telling them, if your eyes are looking at some other guy's wife, pluck your eyes out. If your hand is going to steal somebody else's property, cut your hand off. It's better to do that than end up here in this trash dump where they burn bodies of criminals. You see, there's a practical thing going on here, but you see, Christians want to run with that and call it hell, because that's where the worm dieth not, and the flame doesn't goeth outeth, you see? And so that must mean an eternal hell, since they never die and the flame never goes out. But yet the practical aspect is, if you keep feeding a fire in a dump, and you keep feeding it with flesh, the worms aren't going to die. They're going to keep feasting. You see, the practical aspects. And if the fire doesn't go out, because you keep putting trash on it so the fire doesn't go out. You folks, Gehenna is still there. You see, so it's not eternal. You know, Jesus was talking in the practical of the day, the time. At that time, not the future, not eternal, not hell. Gehenna's there right now. It's a park right outside of the walls of Jerusalem. You can visit it if you ever visit Israel. So, you know, guess what? The fire's out. And the worms, I'm sure they're on the ground. Maybe they didn't die. Well, those back then, they're dead, of course. Okay. Well, I hope I just at least put a seed of doubt and I didn't ramble too terribly much, but this is just something it drives me nuts when I talk to people on Facebook and they want to jump to these conclusions. And I honestly believe Jesus was so down to earth and so practical. Everybody could identify with him, you know? And sure, you know, now that he's sitting at the right hand of God, and there's a little more mysticism going on now. But when you try to apply all this symbolism and mysticism and all this other kind of stuff, conjecture and assumptions, to the practical Jesus who walked and talked amongst people who were a little more simple-minded, not putting them down, but who a lot of them couldn't read and write, and a lot of them were very poor, and they were just sheep without a shepherd, and Jesus' heart went out to them, and you see, Jesus was a man too, folks. Let's not forget that aspect of him. He came as a man, as a practical man. So yes, I will say the why guy, pragmatist Jesus, or the why guy Jesus was a pragmatist. So thank you for viewing.